The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty streets as Marine Corporal Sarah Martinez adjusted her body armor one final time. The weight of her gear felt familiar now after 8 months in Iraq, but something about this mission felt different. Intelligence reports had been coming in all week about increased insurgent activity in the Al sector, and today's patrol was supposed to be a routine sweep through the residential district. Sarah had joined the Marines straight out of high school in Phoenix, Arizona. Her father had served in Vietnam, and her grandfather had fought in World War II. Military service ran in her blood like a river that had been flowing for generations. At 22, she was one of the few female Marines assigned to direct combat operations a distinction that came with both pride and constant pressure to prove herself worthy of the trust her commanding officers had placed in her. The team consisted of 12 Marines, moving in 2 armored vehicles through the narrow streets lined with concrete barriers and razor wire. Sarah rode in the second vehicle, her M16 rifle ready, eyes scanning the windows and rooftops for any sign of movement. The city had been relatively quiet for the past few weeks, but quiet never meant safe. It usually meant trouble was brewing somewhere just out of sight. Their mission was to check on several key locations where intelligence suggested weapons caches might be hidden. The first 2 stops had yielded nothing more than nervous civilians and empty rooms. Children watched from doorways as the Marines moved through their neighborhoods, their dark eyes reflecting a mixture of curiosity and fear that had become all too familiar to Sarah during her deployment. As they approached the third location, a 2-story building that had once housed a small shop on the ground floor, Staff Sergeant raised his hand to signal a halt. Something felt wrong about the street ahead. It was too quiet, too empty for mid-morning in what should have been a busy commercial area. Even the usual sounds of distant traffic and children playing had faded to an uncomfortable silence. Sarah checked her radio equipment and confirmed their position with base camp. The building they were approaching had been identified as a possible safe house for insurgent fighters. Local informants had reported unusual activity there over the past several days, including vehicles arriving late at night and the sound of digging coming from the basement area. The team moved forward in formation, with 4 Marines covering the rear while the others prepared to enter the building. Sarah was assigned to watch the eastern approach, positioning herself behind a concrete barrier that provided cover while maintaining a clear view of the street. Her heart rate increased slightly, but her training kept her movements calm and deliberate. The explosion came without warning. A massive blast erupted from the building they had been approaching, sending chunks of concrete and metal flying in all directions. The force of the explosion knocked Sarah backwards, her ears ringing from the deafening sound. Through the dust and smoke, she could see that the entire front of the building had collapsed, trapping several of her teammates under heavy debris. Before she could fully process what had happened, gunfire erupted from multiple directions. Muzzle flashes appeared in windows across the street as insurgent fighters opened fire on the exposed Marines. Sarah rolled to her left, seeking better cover behind an overturned vehicle that had been damaged in the blast. She could hear Staff Sergeant shouting orders over the radio, trying to coordinate their response while calling for backup and medical evacuation. The ambush had been carefully planned. The explosion was meant to disorient and separate the Marines, making them easier targets for the crossfire that followed. Sarah found herself cut off from the rest of her team, pinned down behind inadequate cover while bullets struck the ground around her position. She returned fire toward the nearest muzzle flash, but the insurgents had chosen their positions well, firing from concealed locations that were difficult to target effectively. For 30 minutes, the firefight continued with neither side able to gain a decisive advantage. Sarah had managed to eliminate at least 2 insurgent fighters from her position, but more seemed to take their place. Her ammunition was running low, and she had taken a bullet graze across her left shoulder that was bleeding steadily, but not severely enough to prevent her from fighting. The situation became critical when she realized that several of her wounded teammates were lying in the open street, exposed to continued gunfire and unable to reach safety on their own. Without hesitation, Sarah made the decision that would define the rest of her life. She left her covered position and ran into the open street, determined to reach her wounded comrades and provide aid. The first wounded Marine she reached was Private Johnson, barely 19 years old and bleeding heavily from wounds to his chest and leg. Sarah dragged him behind a concrete barrier and began applying field dressings while continuing to return fire at insurgent positions. The young Marine was conscious but in severe pain, and Sarah did her best to keep him calm while working to stop his bleeding. As she worked on Johnson's injuries, Sarah felt the first bullet strike her body. The round hit her in the lower back, just below her body armor, sending a shock of pain through her entire torso. She gritted her teeth and continued working on Johnson's wounds, knowing that stopping to address her own injury could mean the difference between life and death for the wounded Marine. The second bullet hit her right leg, shattering her femur and sending her tumbling to the ground beside Johnson. Despite the excruciating pain, Sarah managed to maintain her grip on her rifle and continued providing covering fire for the other Marines who were attempting to reach wounded teammates in different parts of the street. Bullets 3 and 4 struck her within seconds of each other, one piercing her left arm and another hitting her in the abdomen. The impact left her gasping for breath, but she forced herself to stay conscious and alert. She could see that Private Johnson was fatting fast, and she knew that her own survival was now secondary to ensuring that her teammates received the medical attention they desperately needed. The fifth bullet caught her in the chest, just above her heart, punching through her body armor and lodging near her lung. Sarah felt warm blood filling her mouth as she tried to call for help over her radio. Her voice was weak and distorted, but she managed to relay their exact position to the incoming rescue teams and provide details about the number and location of insurgent fighters. Bullets 6, 7, and 8 came in rapid succession as Sarah attempted to crawl toward another wounded Marine who was trapped under debris from the explosion. Each impact sent waves of agony through her body, but she continued moving forward inch by inch, driven by a determination that transcended physical pain. Her training had taught her that Marines never leave their own behind, and she was prepared to die rather than abandon her responsibility to her teammates. The ninth bullet struck her in the neck, missing her major arteries by millimeters but causing severe damage to surrounding tissue. Sarah could feel her strength ebbing away as blood loss began to take its toll. Her vision started to blur, and she had to fight to maintain consciousness. Still, she managed to reach the trapped Marine and begin pulling debris away from his legs. Bullet number 10 hit her in the back of the head, fracturing her skull but somehow missing her brain stem. The impact left her partially paralyzed and struggling to coordinate her movements, but she remained conscious and alert enough to continue providing aid to her wounded teammates. Her hands shook as she applied pressure to bleeding wounds and checked vital signs. The 11th and final bullet struck Sarah in the spine, causing immediate paralysis from the waist down. She collapsed beside the Marine she had been trying to save, no longer able to move her legs or control the lower half of her body. Blood pooled around her position as she lay on the hot concrete, her breathing becoming increasingly labored and shallow. Despite her critical injuries, Sarah managed to maintain radio contact with the incoming rescue teams. She provided detailed information about the tactical situation, including the number of wounded Marines, their specific injuries, and the positions of insurgent fighters who were still active in the area. Her voice was barely a whisper, but her training and determination allowed her to continue functioning as a Marine even as her body began to shut down. As the sound of approaching helicopters grew louder in the distance, Sarah closed her eyes and focused on breathing. Each breath required tremendous effort, and she could feel her life slipping away with each passing moment. But she had accomplished her mission. Her teammates would receive the medical attention they needed, and the information she had provided would help ensure that the rescue teams could reach them safely. The last thing Sarah remembered before losing consciousness was the voice of Staff Sergeant over the radio, telling her that help was almost there and to hang on just a little longer. She tried to respond, but her voice failed her. Instead, she focused all her remaining energy on continuing to breathe, knowing that every second she could stay alive increased the chances that the rescue teams would be able to save her life. The rescue helicopters arrived as the sun reached its peak in the Iraqi sky, their rotors churning up clouds of dust and debris that mixed with the smoke still rising from the destroyed building. The pilots had received Sarah's radio transmissions and knew exactly where to find the wounded Marines, but landing in an active combat zone required split-second timing and nerves of steel. Captain Mike led the SEAL rescue team that fast-roped from the helicopters into the chaotic street. A veteran of multiple deployments in Afghanistan and Iraq, had participated in dozens of combat rescue operations, but the scene that greeted him in was unlike anything he had encountered before. The street was littered with debris, blood, and the bodies of both Marines and insurgent fighters. The first wounded Marine the SEALs reached was Private Johnson, who Sarah had dragged to safety behind the concrete barrier. He was unconscious but still breathing, his chest rising and falling in shallow, irregular patterns. The combat medic immediately began working on his injuries, while and his team secured the area and searched for additional casualties. They found Sarah 30 feet away, lying motionless beside another wounded Marine she had been trying to save. Her body was riddled with bullet holes, and a massive pool of blood had formed around her position. His first instinct was to check for a pulse, but what he found all logic and medical explanation. Despite her catastrophic injuries, Sarah's heart was still beating weakly, and she was somehow still breathing on her own. The SEAL medic, petty officer, quickly assessed Sarah's condition and immediately called for priority medical evacuation. Her injuries were so severe that survival seemed impossible, yet vital signs indicated she was still alive. The bullet wound to her head had caused significant trauma, but miraculously had missed the brain stem that controls essential functions like breathing and heart rate. As the medics worked frantically to stabilize Sarah for transport, she briefly regained consciousness. Her eyes opened slightly and she tried to speak, but only a weak whisper emerged from her lips. Captain leaned close to hear what she was trying to say, and her words would haunt him for the rest of his life. She was asking about her teammates, wanting to know if they were safe and if the wounded Marines were receiving proper medical care. The flight to the combat hospital took 18 minutes, during which Sarah's condition deteriorated rapidly. Her blood pressure dropped to dangerous levels, and twice her heart stopped beating entirely, requiring emergency resuscitation. The flight medics performed 2 blood transfusions en route, but her injuries were so extensive that they were essentially buying time rather than providing definitive treatment. Dr. Jennifer, the chief trauma surgeon at the combat hospital, had seen thousands of wounded soldiers during her deployment to Iraq, but Sarah's case challenged every aspect of her medical training. The bullet wounds had damaged virtually every major organ system, and the amount of blood loss should have been fatal within minutes of the initial injuries. Yet somehow, Sarah continued to cling to life with a determination that seemed to transcend physical limitations. The surgical team worked for 7 hours to address the most life-threatening injuries. They removed bullet fragments from her chest cavity, repaired damage to her liver and kidneys, and stabilized the spinal fracture that had caused her paralysis. The wound to her skull required delicate neurosurgery to relieve pressure on her brain and prevent further damage to critical areas. Throughout the surgery, Sarah's vital signs remained unstable but present. Her heart rate fluctuated wildly, and her breathing required mechanical assistance, but she never completely lost the will to live that had sustained her during those crucial minutes in the street. The surgical team marveled at her resilience, knowing that most patients with similar injuries would have died long before reaching the hospital. When Sarah finally emerged from surgery, she was placed in the intensive care unit under constant monitoring. Doctor gave her a 5% chance of survival, and even if she did survive, the extent of permanent damage to her brain and spinal cord meant she would likely never walk again and might suffer significant cognitive impairment. For the first 24 hours after surgery, Sarah drifted in and out of consciousness. When she was awake, she experienced severe pain despite heavy medication, but she remained alert enough to ask about her teammates. The nursing staff, led by Lieutenant Commander Williams, made sure to keep her informed about the condition of the other wounded Marines, knowing that this information was crucial to her psychological well-being. Private Johnson, the young Marine Sarah had dragged to safety, was recovering well from his injuries. The other wounded Marines were also stable, and doctors expected all of them to make full recoveries. This news seemed to provide Sarah with a sense of peace that helped her through the most difficult hours of her recovery. On the second day after the ambush, Sarah's condition took an unexpected turn for the better. Her vital signs stabilized, and she began responding more consistently to medical staff. The improvement was gradual but noticeable, and doctor cautiously revised her prognosis from 5% to 20% chance of survival. Captain visited Sarah in the ICU, wanting to personally thank her for the courage she had displayed during the firefight. He found her awake and alert, despite the extensive medical equipment surrounding her bed. When he told her that her actions had saved the lives of 4 Marines, tears formed in her eyes, but she managed a weak smile. The story of Sarah's heroism began to spread throughout the military medical facility and beyond. Word reached her family in Phoenix, and her parents immediately made arrangements to fly to Germany, where she would be transferred for more advanced medical treatment. Her father, a Vietnam veteran himself, understood the significance of what his daughter had accomplished and felt a mixture of pride and anguish that description. As Sarah prepared for the medical flight to Germany, she remained conscious and aware of her surroundings. The paralysis in her legs was complete, and doctors warned that it would likely be permanent. The head injury had affected her coordination and caused some memory problems, but her cognitive abilities remained largely intact. During the flight to Germany, Sarah experienced several medical emergencies that required immediate intervention. Her blood pressure dropped dramatically twice, and she developed a serious infection at one of the surgical sites. The medical team aboard the transport aircraft worked around the clock to keep her stable, knowing that losing her now would be a tragedy beyond measure. The regional medical center in Germany had been of Sarah's incoming transfer and had assembled their best trauma specialists to continue her treatment. Dr. Michael, a neurosurgeon with extensive experience treating combat injuries, reviewed her medical files during the flight and prepared for the complex procedures that would be required to optimize her chances of recovery. Upon arrival in Germany, Sarah was immediately taken to surgery again to address the infection and perform additional repairs to her spinal column. The German medical team worked in coordination with American military doctors to provide the most advanced treatment available. The surgery lasted 12 hours and required the skills of specialists from multiple medical disciplines. When Sarah woke up in the German hospital, she found her parents at her bedside. Her mother was holding her hand while her father sat quietly in a chair nearby, his eyes red from crying. The reunion was emotional beyond words, as her family had been told repeatedly that she might not survive her injuries. Sarah's recovery in Germany was slow but steady. Physical therapy began almost immediately, focusing on maintaining strength and mobility in the parts of her body that were not affected by the spinal injury. She worked with occupational therapists to relearn basic tasks and adapt to her new physical limitations. The psychological impact of her injuries was as challenging as the physical recovery. Sarah struggled with survivor guilt, wondering why she had lived when so many other brave soldiers had died in Iraq. Counselors helped her work through these feelings, reminding her that her survival was not random luck, but the result of her own extraordinary will to live and the exceptional medical care she had received. After 6 weeks in Germany, Sarah was deemed stable enough for transport to Walter Reed Army Medical Center in Washington, D.C., where she would continue her rehabilitation. The flight back to the United States marked another milestone in her remarkable journey from the dusty streets of to the advanced medical facilities that were giving her a second chance at life. The night before her transfer to Walter Reed, Sarah lay awake thinking about the Marines she had served with in Iraq. She had received letters from several of her teammates, including Private Johnson, who credited her with saving his life. These connections to her military family provided her with strength and purpose as she faced the long road to recovery that lay ahead. Walter Reed Army Medical Center became Sarah's new home for the next 18 months, a sprawling complex where some of America's most severely wounded warriors fought their own battles against injuries that would have been considered fatal just a generation earlier. The rehabilitation wing buzzed with activity around the clock, as physical therapists, occupational therapists, and psychologists worked with patients who were redefining what it meant to overcome impossible odds. Sarah's room overlooked a courtyard where other wounded veterans practiced walking with prosthetic limbs or maneuvered wheelchairs through obstacle courses designed to simulate real-world challenges. Watching their determination inspired her during the darkest moments of her own recovery, when the pain seemed unbearable and the future appeared uncertain. Dr. Foster, Sarah's lead physician at Walter Reed, had treated hundreds of combat veterans, but she remained amazed by Sarah's progress. The young Marine who had arrived nearly dead was now sitting up in bed, engaging in complex conversations and demonstrating cognitive abilities that the severity of her brain injury. While the paralysis in her legs remained complete, sensation and function in her arms and upper body had returned almost entirely to normal. The physical therapy sessions were grueling, often lasting 4 hours per day. Sarah worked with specialists who helped her build strength in her arms and core muscles, knowing that these would become her primary means of mobility for the rest of her life. She learned to transfer herself from bed to wheelchair, to navigate curbs and stairs, and to perform countless daily tasks that most people take for granted. Lieutenant Colonel James Harrison, Sarah's commanding officer, visited her regularly at Walter Reed. He brought news from Iraq, updates on the other Marines from her unit, and most importantly, he ensured that Sarah understood the impact of her heroic actions during the ambush. Her split-second decision to leave cover and aid her wounded teammates had prevented what could have been a massacre, and her radio communications had guided the rescue teams to their exact location. The military investigation into the ambush revealed that insurgent fighters had spent weeks planning the attack, using the building explosion as bait to lure Marines into a carefully constructed kill zone. Sarah's actions had disrupted their plan and forced them to engage in a prolonged firefight that ultimately led to their defeat. Intelligence gathered from the scene helped prevent similar ambushes in other parts of the city. As her physical condition improved, Sarah began working with a psychologist who specialized in combat trauma. Doctor helped her process the emotional impact of the ambush and address the survivor guilt that plagued many wounded veterans. Sarah struggled with nightmares and flashbacks, but she gradually learned coping strategies that allowed her to move forward with her life. The most challenging aspect of Sarah's recovery was accepting the permanence of her paralysis. Multiple surgeries had stabilized her spine, but the damage to her spinal cord was irreversible. She would never again feel sensation in her legs or walk without assistance. For someone whose entire adult life had been built around physical capabilities and military service, this reality required a complete reconstruction of her identity and future plans. Her parents remained constant presences throughout her rehabilitation, taking turns staying with her in Washington while maintaining their lives in Phoenix. Her father's experience as a combat veteran helped him understand the unique challenges Sarah faced, while her mother provided the emotional support that sustained her through the most difficult days. The Purple Heart ceremony took place in Sarah's hospital room, with General Williams presiding over the presentation. The medal, awarded to military personnel wounded or killed in action, felt heavy in Sarah's hands as she realized it represented not just her own sacrifice, but the courage of all the Marines who had served alongside her in Iraq. The ceremony was private, attended only by her family and closest medical staff, but word of her heroism had spread throughout the military community. 6 months into her stay at Walter Reed, Sarah received an unexpected visitor. Private Johnson, the young Marine she had saved in, had fully recovered from his injuries and was preparing to return to active duty. The reunion was emotional for both of them, as Johnson credited Sarah with giving him a second chance at life. He had written her dozens of letters during his own recovery, but seeing her in person allowed him to express his gratitude face to face. Sarah's story began attracting attention from outside the military as well. A journalist from the Washington Post wrote a detailed article about her experience, focusing on the broader issues facing wounded veterans and the advanced medical treatments that were saving lives in unprecedented numbers. The article led to speaking requests and invitations to participate in veteran advocacy organizations. As her discharge date from Walter Reed approached, Sarah faced the challenge of building a new life outside the military. The Marines had been her entire world for 4 years, and the prospect of civilian life seemed daunting. Career counselors helped her explore options that would utilize her leadership skills and military experience while accommodating her physical limitations. Sarah decided to pursue a degree in social work, with the goal of eventually working with other wounded veterans. She had seen firsthand how critical psychological support was during recovery, and she wanted to use her experience to help others navigate similar challenges. The Veterans Administration approved her education benefits, and she was accepted into the social work program at Georgetown University. The transition to civilian life and academic study proved more difficult than Sarah had anticipated. Simple tasks like navigating the campus in her wheelchair required careful planning, and she had to develop entirely new study habits to accommodate the memory and concentration issues that lingered from her brain injury. However, her professors and fellow students were supportive, and she gradually found her rhythm in the academic environment. During her second semester at Georgetown, Sarah was invited to speak at a veterans conference about her experiences in combat and recovery. The speech marked the first time she had publicly shared the details of the ambush, and her story resonated powerfully with the audience of veterans, family members, and medical professionals. Her speaking engagements as words spread about her compelling story and natural ability to connect with audiences. Sarah found that sharing her experience not only helped others understand the realities of combat and recovery, but also provided her with a sense of purpose that had been missing since leaving the Marines. The nonprofit organization Sarah founded during her final year at Georgetown focused specifically on supporting female veterans, who often faced unique challenges in transitioning to civilian life. Her organization provided mentorship, career guidance, and advocacy services, filling gaps in the existing support system for veterans. Sarah's personal life also began to flourish as she built new relationships and redefined what happiness meant in her post-military life. She met David, a physical therapist who worked with veterans, during a fundraising event for her organization. Their relationship developed slowly, built on mutual respect and shared commitment to serving the veteran community. The decision to marry David represented another milestone in Sarah's journey of rebuilding her life. The wedding ceremony was held at the same chapel at Walter Reed, where she had spent so many months recovering, surrounded by the medical staff who had saved her life and the fellow veterans who had become her extended family. 5 years after the ambush Sarah returned to Iraq as part of a civilian delegation focused on humanitarian aid and reconstruction efforts. Standing in a wheelchair on Iraqi soil again brought back vivid memories of that terrible day. But it also provided closure and an opportunity to see the positive changes that had occurred in the country since her deployment. The trip to Iraq included a visit to the site where the ambush had occurred. The destroyed building had been rebuilt, and the street where Sarah had nearly died was now bustling with normal civilian activity. Local residents who learned of her story expressed gratitude for her service and the sacrifices she had made for their country. Sarah's legacy extends far beyond her individual story of survival and recovery. The medical techniques developed during her treatment have been used to save countless other wounded veterans, and her advocacy work has improved support systems for disabled veterans across the country. The young Marine who took 11 bullets and survived through sheer force of will had transformed her trauma into a lifelong mission of service. Today, Sarah continues her work with wounded veterans while serving on advisory boards for several military medical organizations. She has written a book about her experiences, with proceeds supporting veterans programs, and maintains speaking engagements around the country. Her story serves as a reminder that heroism comes in many forms, and that the human spirit's capacity for resilience can overcome even the most devastating challenges. The small scar on her forehead from the bullet that nearly killed her serves as a daily reminder of how close she came to death in that street. But rather than a symbol of trauma, Sarah views it as a badge of honor representing her commitment to never leaving a fellow Marine behind, regardless of the personal cost. Her survival was not just a medical miracle, but a testament to the power of purpose, determination, and the unbreakable bonds formed between warriors who served together in combat.